too much data. I'm just going to try closing PowerPoint. Maybe it gets worse, maybe it gets better. All right, I think we're back. Okay, so let me just finish up. We've got like maybe 10 minutes left. Okay, so for basic strategies for sensory processing, I already mentioned this, but maybe some of you know this already. So here's an example of the somatosensory system. So the idea is that, so somatosensory is the sense of touch, right? So you have sensory input that's related to neurons in the dorsal horn, the spinal cord. I can't get back my cursor. I'm not sure why that is. Okay, it's back now. Okay, good. All right, so we have somatosensory input related to neurons in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. So the spinal cord has a dorsal part, right? That's near your back, and the ventral part is near your belly. So the dorsal horn pulls in all the information from your sensory system. It's then going to send that up to the thalamus. In particular, there are areas called like the ventral posterior lateral thalamus that has somatosensory input in it. And then that'll go up to cortex, to an area that is called primary somatosensory cortex. Okay, so basically you have projections through the thalamus for most modalities to certain subnuclei within the thalamus that's up to a primary area. There are exceptions to that, so that's true for the visual system, for the auditory system, for the somatosensory system. Vestibular system is more complicated. There's really no vestibular cortex, and the vestibular system is organized in a fundamentally different way that we'll talk about. And there's also the proprioceptive sense, and we're really only learning to understand how proprioceptive signals are really processed. That's been sort of understudied. So proprioception is how you have a sense of how your body's organized relative to itself. It tells you basically, how your muscle, the position of your limbs, right, relative to your body. Okay. So as I said, the general strategies for sensory processing, because you're going to hear about visual system, vestibular system, auditory system. So what you have is information projecting from, say, lower structures. So Dr. Wang will talk about the auditory system. Information goes into the medial geniculate nucleus, right? So everything's kind of going through this same general area. Right? This was the Italian sapon. Visual, and I guess vestibular systems, myself and Dr. Shadmir. Visual systems go through the dorsolateral geniculate. Vestibular system actually goes with somatosensory information through the VPL, the ventral posterior lateral thalamus. So you have basically multiple structures working in parallel to bring in sensory information up to cortex. And here is primary somatosensory cortex here, right, which is just sitting behind that central sulcus that I showed you. On the other side, towards the front of the brain, is motor cortex, so it's very closely located. So if you think about processing across the cortical areas, it gets complicated. Like cortex is big, but you're only sending primary sensory information to one primary area, right? So that's what's shown here. You have different areas for the different system, auditory, visual, somatosensory. So these are primary areas that get direct input from the thalamus, right? So here's primary visual, primary auditory, primary somatosensory. Then these areas send information up to sort of second tier areas that do more processing, right? So in the visual system, you have a pathway for motion and movement, and another one for pattern discrimination. So these would be these, so what's called the ventral and the dorsal stream. So these are areas that people think of being still primarily visual, but are higher level. And then, of course, ultimately, when you're interacting with the world, you're not just seeing, you're not just hearing, right? You're pulling all this information together. So what you have are these multimodal areas that are even beyond there that are pulling information together. So this is a textbook that's about ready to be reissued. So it's a 5th edition, the 6th edition's about ready to come out. So it'll be interesting to see what they do with this figure, because what we've learned over the last 5 years, really, is that more and more, the further you go back, information from multiple modalities is actually being combined earlier and earlier. And for example, if you even look in primary visual cortex, you can see sort of signatures of eye movements and things. They have neurons that are responsible for locomotion in mice. So it's become a more complicated view of the world than this initially kind of sensory to motor progression, which is really interesting. It's something I'll talk about in my lecture. So this, the old view is that you have sensory input, you passively sense that, and then you operate it on some way, and then you turn it to a motor command. What's really clear is that motor commands are shaping sensory inputs really from the very early stages. But this idea is still pretty much fixed in the way people talk about structure, so I think it's worth talking about primary visual areas or auditory areas. That's the way people still call these structures and talk about them. Okay, so just to, I'm almost at the end here. Strategies for sensory processing cortical sequence. So again, somatosensory system example, primary somatosensory cortex, which is thought of as a unimodal cortex. So it's hard now to say it's perfectly unimodal. Then, but primarily, it would be primarily somatosensory. Then areas that are association cortices that would do higher level processing on somatosensory information. And then multi-association cortical areas where you have single neurons that could be responsive to visual input, tactile, auditory. Okay, and I just have 2 slides here to finish with. So in terms of voluntary motor control, what people tend to focus on are this cortical spinal tract. So remember I showed you that 6-layer cortex with layer 5 being really thick, right? So those are neurons, those parameter cells that I showed you in there. Actually, they're axons, if you trace them down. They go all the way from motor cortex down to your spinal cord. So those are probably the longest axons that we have, right? And that pathway is really not developed very well in animals other than humans. It's really very special to us. And the idea, it allows us, if you want to become a surgeon and do very fine things with your hands, you're probably really reliant on a pathway like that. But maybe for picking up a coffee cup, it's less critical. Or if you're trying to thread a needle, for example, that pathway would be probably pretty important. But we also have many other ways to get motor information down to the spinal cord. And that's what's shown here. So it looks really complicated, but just it makes the point. So we have motor cortex up here, and many of the voluntary movements that we generate are not done via this direct cortical spinal pathway. So instead we have descending pathways from cortex that go to places like thalamus. A big part of thalamus is actually motor. It's not very well studied. People still really need to understand better. There are structures in the midbrain. You now know what the midbrain is, the area called the red nucleus. The pons, the cerebellum is very important. There are big links between the basal ganglion, the cortex, and the cerebellum that seem to be there to help keep movement calibrated and and keep you motivated. And again, there are also ascending pathways. Of course, we always want to think of things going from vision to motor, right, or from somatosensory to motor, sensory motor. But there's always feedback. So there's these feedback pathways also shown here in purple. So that's the end of my lecture. I just want to thank everybody for their attention. Sorry about my voice. Thanks for your help with the AV. And feel free to contact me if you have any questions. And I'll see you, I guess, later in the term.